Be me, name is Caldwell. 44 years old, senior lead architect. 19 years in the industry. Licensed in 4 states. Stamped blueprints for buildings that millions of people walk through daily. Found out last month my pay would now depend on empathy scores. Not structural calculations. Not safety compliance. Not whether my buildings stand up, but how my coworkers felt about my vibes. This is the story of how a respected architecture firm replaced merit-based compensation with subjective empathy metrics. How they told senior architects that our technical expertise mattered less than our emotional availability. How we refused to subsidize ideology with labor that keeps buildings standing. And how our exodus left them with a payroll full of activists and a portfolio full of failures. Buildings don't care about your feelings. Physics doesn't negotiate with empathy scores. Gravity doesn't grade on a curve. We tried to explain this. Nobody listened. So we left. And the blueprints started failing. Exactly like we warned. The firm was Mercer and Associates, a mid-sized architecture and structural engineering firm with a 40-year reputation for commercial and institutional projects. We designed office towers, hospitals, university buildings, the kind of structures that required precision, expertise, and absolute certainty about load calculations. When you stamp a blueprint, you're certifying that the building won't collapse. That responsibility doesn't allow for ambiguity. Our compensation had always reflected that responsibility. Base salary plus performance bonuses. Tied to projects completed, budgets met, client satisfaction. Billable hours, technical accuracy, safety compliance. Measurable outcomes that connected pay to contribution. Senior architects earn more because they delivered more. Because their expertise prevented disasters that junior staff couldn't anticipate. Holbrook was our chief architect, 56 years old with 28 years at the firm. His signature was on buildings across the eastern seaboard. He had caught structural flaws that would have killed people if they'd made it to construction. His expertise was literally life-saving, and his compensation reflected that value. Prescott was our senior structural engineer. 51 years old, specialized in load-bearing calculations. The kind of math that determines whether a roof holds or caves in during a snowstorm. His work was checked and rechecked, but rarely corrected, because he didn't make mistakes. Couldn't afford to make mistakes. When mistakes meant building failures. Ramona led our hospital design division, one of the most demanding specialties in architecture. Hospitals have complex requirements, backup power systems, sterile environments, structural redundancy for equipment. She had earned her position through 15 years of flawless work on projects that saved lives by functioning correctly. I handled commercial developments. Office towers, retail centers, mixed-use complexes. Projects worth hundreds of millions. Where my signature meant personal liability. If something went wrong, if a calculation was off, if a design flaw caused injury, I could lose my license, my career, my freedom. That accountability was reflected in my pay. The firm had been acquired 2 years ago by a larger conglomerate that owned various professional services companies. The acquisition was supposed to bring resources and stability. Instead, it brought Margot as our new CEO and Seraphine as our new HR director. Both came from the parent company's corporate culture division. Neither had ever worked in architecture. Margot's first year was mostly observation. Learning the business, she said. Understanding our culture. Identifying opportunities for improvement. We showed her our processes, our quality controls, our liability management systems. She nodded and took notes. We didn't realize she was planning to dismantle everything. The announcement came during a quarterly all-hands meeting. Seraphine had prepared a presentation about compensation equity and holistic value recognition. The slides were colorful and used words like inclusive metrics and whole person evaluation. My stomach tightened before she even reached the substance. The new system was called the Comprehensive Contribution Assessment. Traditional performance metrics, billable hours, project completion, technical accuracy would now represent only 40% of compensation calculations. The remaining 60% would come from what they called collaborative culture scores, peer-evaluated metrics measuring empathy, inclusivity, emotional availability, and team support. The room processed this silently. 60% of our compensation, based on how coworkers felt about us. Not on whether our buildings stood up. Not on whether our calculations were correct. Not on whether we met client requirements. On feelings. Subjective, unmeasurable feelings. Holbrook raised his hand immediately. He asked how empathy scores would be validated. How would subjective assessments be calibrated to ensure fairness? What prevented personal grudges or personality conflicts from affecting someone's pay? Seraphine said the system was designed to capture holistic contribution that traditional metrics missed. Holbrook asked a simpler question. If his structural calculations were perfect, but his empathy scores were low, would his pay decrease? Seraphine said yes, potentially significantly, if his collaborative culture contribution wasn't meeting expectations. Holbrook asked who set those expectations. For a metric that couldn't be measured. Prescott spoke next. He pointed out that structural engineering wasn't a popularity contest. His job was to tell people when their designs were unsafe, which often made him unpopular with the designers. If his pay depended on being liked by the people he had to correct, he would face impossible pressure to approve unsafe designs. Seraphine said that framing was unnecessarily adversarial. Ramona asked about the legal implications. Architecture licenses carry personal liability. If she stamped a flawed blueprint to maintain good relationships, and the building failed, she would be personally responsible. Legally, professionally, potentially criminally. Was the company assuming that liability? Seraphine said that was a separate conversation. I asked about the math. Top performers currently earned bonuses averaging $40,000, based on exceeding measurable targets. Under the new system, that $40,000 would depend mostly on peer perception, not on whether we actually exceeded targets. Seraphine confirmed that was correct, said it would encourage more collaborative behavior. The meeting ended without resolution. Senior staff gathered afterward. In Holbrook's office. The conversation was brief and unanimous. We couldn't accept liability for buildings, while being paid based on popularity. The incentives were fundamentally broken. We would make our position clear. Holbrook drafted a formal response to Margot, signed by 11 senior architects and engineers. We explained the liability structure of our profession, the personal risk we assumed with every stamped blueprint, the impossibility of maintaining safety standards while being evaluated on subjective metrics that incentivized approval over accuracy. Margot's response arrived 2 days later. She acknowledged our concerns, said the firm valued our expertise, but needed to evolve with modern workplace expectations. The comprehensive contribution assessment would proceed, with minor adjustments to address our feedback. The adjustments were cosmetic. The fundamental structure remained. The empathy evaluations began the following month. Every employee received a survey asking them to rate colleagues on dimensions like emotional availability, inclusive communication, supportive presence, and collaborative spirit. The results would be compiled into scores that affected compensation. The surveys were supposedly anonymous, but in a firm of 60 people, anonymity was illusory. The dynamics shifted immediately. Junior staff suddenly had power over senior compensation. Personal relationships became financial relationships. Technical disagreements became risky, because the person you corrected could tank your empathy score and cost you thousands of dollars. In your next bonus calculation, Prescott stopped pushing back on structural concerns as forcefully. When a junior architect's design had load-bearing issues, he flagged them quietly rather than in meetings. He couldn't afford to be seen as confrontational. His empathy scores were already lower than average because his job required delivering unwelcome news. Every correction was now a financial risk. Ramona faced similar pressure in hospital design. Her specialty required rejecting ideas that didn't meet code. Medical facility requirements were non-negotiable. But every rejection affected how people felt about her. Her empathy scores dropped in the first evaluation, despite her technical work being flawless, because she had said no to things that needed no. And people didn't like hearing no. The first evaluation cycle showed exactly the pattern we had predicted. Technical excellence had no correlation with empathy scores. Some of the best engineers had the lowest collaborative culture ratings because their jobs required criticism. Some of the weakest performers had excellent empathy scores because they never challenged anyone. I received my results with resignation. Technical metrics exceeded expectations. Collaborative culture score needs improvement. Net impact on bonus negative $12,000 for doing my job correctly, while apparently not being nice enough about the doing. Sage was one of the new hires Seraphine brought in, a culture and collaboration coordinator with a background in organizational psychology and no technical training whatsoever. Her role was to facilitate the empathy evaluation process, lead team-building exercises, and ensure the cultural transformation was proceeding. She earned more than 2 junior architects combined. The overhead started growing immediately. Culture coordinators, inclusion facilitators, wellness program managers, collaborative experience designers. Titles that meant nothing technical. Roles that produced nothing billable. Consuming budget that used to fund. Actual architects doing actual work. The payroll bloated while output shrank. By the 3rd month, the ratio had shifted visibly. For every 3 technical staff, we now had 1 culture-focused staff. Meetings multiplied. Team-building exercises consumed hours. The time available for actual design work contracted while the non-productive headcount expanded. Clients started noticing that projects were taking longer. Holbrook resigned on a Thursday afternoon. 28 years of service ending with a brief letter citing irreconcilable differences in professional philosophy. He couldn't maintain his professional liability while being evaluated on metrics that discouraged the critical assessment his job required. His departure was quiet but devastating. The exodus followed his example. Prescott left the following week, took a position at a smaller firm that still evaluated engineers on engineering. 2 more senior architects followed within days. Ramona held out longer but eventually departed for a hospital design specialty firm that understood what her work actually required. I was among the last senior staff to leave. 19 years invested in this firm. Relationships built over decades. Reputation established through consistent excellence. All of it worth less than empathy scores. That measured nothing real. I found a position at a firm run by engineers who still believed that competence mattered. The departure of senior staff left critical gaps. Projects in progress suddenly had no senior oversight. Blueprints requiring license stamps had no one qualified to stamp them. The junior staff who remained weren't ready for the responsibility, the liability they would assume by signing off on work they couldn't verify. Ellis was one of the junior architects who stayed. 29 years old, for years of experience, suddenly the most senior technical person on 3 major projects. He told me later that the pressure was impossible. He was being asked to approve designs he couldn't fully evaluate because the people who could evaluate them were gone. He raised concerns with Margot. Asked for external review, senior consultation, ways to ensure safety without the departed expertise. Margot said the firm had confidence in the remaining team, that the senior staff's departure was an opportunity for younger professionals to step up. Ellis asked what happened if they stepped up wrong. Margot said that framing was unnecessarily negative. The first project failure came 4 months after the exodus. A commercial development our firm had designed was flagged during construction review for structural deficiencies. The steel framework specifications were inadequate for the load requirements. The error should have been caught by senior review. There was no senior review anymore. The client halted construction, demanded explanation. Our firm scrambled to respond. But the people who could explain the calculations were gone. The people who could fix the specifications were gone. We had culture coordinators. They couldn't recalculate load tolerances. Whitmore represented a hospital system that had 3 projects in progress with our firm. After the commercial project failure became public, he requested an urgent meeting. He asked who was providing senior technical oversight on his projects. The answer wasn't satisfying. He asked about our liability coverage given the staffing changes. The answer was worse. Whitmore paused the projects pending review, which meant paused payments, which meant cash flow problems for a firm that had bloated its payroll with non-technical staff while losing its revenue-generating talent. The mathematics were unforgiving. 2 more clients pulled projects within a month, citing concerns about technical capacity. Our insurance carrier sent a review team, asked questions about our professional staffing levels, about senior oversight procedures, about quality control processes. The answers triggered a premium increase that the firm couldn't afford. Margot scheduled an emergency leadership meeting. She acknowledged that the transition had been more challenging than anticipated. She proposed reaching out to departed senior staff, offering return bonuses and revised compensation structures. She seemed to finally understand what had been lost. Holbrook's response was brief. He forwarded her the letter he had sent 6 months earlier, explaining exactly what would happen if they proceeded with empathy-based compensation. He noted that everything he had predicted had occurred exactly as described. He was not available for consultation at any price. Prescott didn't respond at all. He had moved on professionally and emotionally. The firm that had told him his expertise was less valuable than his emotional availability could now see the value of his expertise in its absence. He felt no obligation to rescue them from consequences they had chosen. I received Margot's outreach with mixed feelings. Part of me wanted to help the junior staff who were struggling through no fault of their own. But returning meant validating a system that had driven us away. It meant accepting that they could treat expertise as expendable and then buy it back when convenient. I declined politely. The firm entered crisis management, hired external senior consultants at premium rates to review the projects that internal staff couldn't handle. The consultants cost more per hour than the departed senior staff had cost per day. The math of the empathy system was becoming painfully clear. Seraphine was terminated 6 months after the exodus began. The official reason was restructuring, but everyone understood. Her compensation system had driven away the people who generated revenue and attracted the people who consumed it. The comprehensive contribution assessment was quietly discontinued. Margot survived longer, but was eventually replaced by a CEO with actual architecture experience, who understood that buildings required builders, and builders required respect. The firm is still recovering, smaller than before, chastened, cautious, slowly rebuilding the expertise it destroyed. Through years of humility, it could have avoided. The departed staff scattered across the industry. Holbrook consults for firms that value his expertise. Prescott is chief engineer at a regional firm that never considered empathy scores. Ramona designs hospitals that save lives because they function correctly. We all landed somewhere that respects what we do. The junior staff who stayed faced the hardest path. Ellis eventually left too, burned out from impossible responsibility. The experience had damaged his confidence in an industry he used to love. He switched to project management, where he wouldn't carry liability for decisions he couldn't verify. The lesson connects to everything happening in professional fields. The people who do the actual work, who carry the actual liability, who have the actual expertise, are not interchangeable with people who have good intentions and collaborative attitudes. Some jobs require competence that cannot be measured in empathy surveys. Architecture is one of those jobs. Structural engineering is one of those jobs. Medicine, aviation, nuclear power. Any field where incompetence kills cannot be evaluated on subjective metrics that ignore whether the work is actually correct. Feelings don't hold up buildings. The empathy scores measured nothing useful, but destroyed everything valuable. Drove away the people who kept buildings standing. Attracted people who kept meetings pleasant. The buildings didn't care about pleasant meetings. They cared about correct calculations, from people qualified to make them, who were gone. For anyone in a technical field facing similar pressure to accept subjective evaluation of objective work, know that you're not wrong to resist, that your expertise has value, That cannot be captured in empathy surveys. And that firms who forget this learn through consequences. What they wouldn't learn through warnings. We warned them. They didn't listen. The buildings taught them instead. Buildings are excellent teachers. They don't grade on curves. They don't negotiate. They just stand or fall, based on whether the calculations were right, not on how anyone felt about them. Anyway, that's my story about subjective pay scales and senior architect resignations, about empathy scores replacing expertise, about a firm that traded competence for culture and got neither in the end, just a payroll full of activists and a portfolio full of failures. Exactly what we predicted. Exactly what they ignored. Physics doesn't care about your feelings.